We've taken a detailed look at the GoPro Hero 3 as well as some of the items you see here in previous videos. For those of you who haven't yet taken a look, I'll leave links to these reviews at the end and in the description below. In this video we start a new mini series all related to using the camera and on how to get the best out of your GoPro. Today we'll start with the items that make this camera so versatile. Welcome to Ifty's Tech Corner, where today we'll be looking at using and extending the life of your GoPro mounts. So we'll start by taking a look at the actual mount itself here. As you can see, each mount turns your camera by 90 degrees. So if I was to mount my camera on top of this, let's just grab my camera. So at the moment you can see my camera is actually facing forwards. If I remove my camera and add this onto the top, you can now see that if I was to mount my camera will be pointing to the side rather than pointing forwards. So each mount will rotate the camera by 90 degrees. Now if you don't want that, you have to actually attach two of the mounts together like I've done here. And what that will do is rotate it by 90 degrees and then rotate it by 90 degrees back. And you can keep your camera pointing in a straight direction. Now the only problem with this is the more mounts you use, the more vibration you introduce into your actual image, because the camera is mounted further away from the actual fixing point at the bottom, and that increases the chance of vibration in your image. So you have mounts like these. Now these are straight mounts. These do not rotate 90 degrees as you can see here. And you get these with backpacks, so the battery backpack and the LCD backpack. And they come in really handy because you can mount your camera just a little bit away from the attachment point, but you still have full range of motion, full pivot on the actual camera itself. So that's the straight mount attachment, very handy to have in your arsenal. Now another tip is when storing your mounts, what a lot of people do so that they don't lose the nut, the bolt or the actual mount itself, what a lot of people do is actually leave the nut and bolt in the actual mount like this, which is perfectly fine. It's how I store my mounts. However, try not to over tighten the thumb screw with nothing fixed in between, because this will bend the plastic slightly and that makes attaching mounts afterwards even more difficult. You find yourself having to force other mounts or your camera into these slots because you've bent the actual plastic. So when storing mounts, it's always good to leave some slack in there, leave it nice and loose, but not loose enough that it can actually fall out. Now another tip or another way to store your mounts is actually store them together. So actually fix them together like this, and you can tighten it as much as you like then, because you've got no chance of actually bending any of the plastic, and you're not going to lose your mounts either. So actually put them together and store them this way also. Now the actual nuts on the mounts themselves are very small and they are difficult to find. So if you lose these, it's not so easy to find replacements for these nuts. Sometimes you may be putting a bolt in and the nut will fall out because sometimes they can be quite loose. And if you're out on the field, finding these small nuts on the floor can be difficult. So a quick way to get around that is a little blob of glue on each side of the nut, so just a very small amount on each side of the nut, and it will stop these nuts from actually falling out of the mount. Now talking of nuts and bolts, let's take a closer look at the actual bolt itself. What you may find is when you're tightening the bolt on an actual mount, the bolt will seem as though it's turning forever and the actual screw inside won't be, and the actual mount itself will still feel quite loose. So what a lot of people tend to do is actually fill this hole with glue so that the actual screw inside is glued to the actual bolt, so that you can tighten the bolt as much as you like and the screw will still be attached to the bolt via glue, so will still be turning. Now I don't like to do that. What I prefer to do instead is tighten as much as you can, so finger tighten as much as you can, and then use a Phillips screwdriver to get in there and just give it a quarter turn with a Phillips screwdriver, and you'll find that you can't turn your mount, or your mount won't move whatsoever, so it will be as tight as you could possibly get it. So don't fill this with glue, instead tighten it as much as you can with your finger and then use a Phillips screwdriver just to give it another quarter turn and you'll be good to go. Now we have two different lengths of bolts, as you can see here. One is quite a bit longer than the second. Now the shorter bolt is to be used with the actual mounts themselves, like this for example. So you use the shorter bolts to attach mounts to each other, and you use the longer bolt to attach the actual camera to your mount. Now the reason why this is longer is that when you actually attach your camera, the mount protrudes further than the actual camera casing, as you can see here, so you can easily tighten and loosen the actual bolt and keep your camera nice and secure. If I try to place the shorter bolt into the mount here, you can see it hits the actual casing and you'll have difficulty in turning and actually getting a nice tight connection there. So use the longer bolt with your actual camera. Now if you're out in the field, it may be easier to try and distinguish between the two by placing some white paint or something around the outside of this bolt here, just so you can easily distinguish just by a quick glance on which is the longer and which is the shorter bolt. But longer bolt with the camera, shorter bolt between mounts. Now moving on to base plates, there's two different types of base plates. One is completely straight and one, the bottom one you can see, is very slightly curved. And the curved one is to be used with motorcycle helmets, for example. And you can easily distinguish between the two because the curved one will be square shaped from the top, whereas the straight mount will have rounded edges. Now when placing mounts, the actual sticky pad of the mount is very strong. When placing these on a surface, make sure the surface is nice and free of dust and grit and so on, and give it about 24 hours to fully cure. After about 24 hours, you'll find that it's very difficult to remove, so it'll be nice and secure. When you want to remove these cleanly, use something like a heat gun or a hairdryer on a very hot setting, really warm it up, and you'll find that you'll be able to peel it away, still with some force. It still won't be very easy, but you'll be able to peel it away nice and cleanly. So use a heat gun or a hairdryer to actually remove, and when you apply this to a nice clean surface, give it 24 hours to cure and you'll find it's nice and stable. Now when using the base plate, so when this base plate is attached to a surface, you attach the camera or your mounts to a quick release mount. And this slides into your actual base plate here in either direction from the top or the bottom, and you can mount your camera in this way. Now there are two different types of quick release mount. I've got the two different types here. I've got a shorter one here and a what's known as a J-buckle mount on the top here. With the shorter one, especially when you're using a backpack on your camera, you have a very limited range of motion. So your camera can only tilt back and forward only a slight distance before the actual camera starts to hit the bottom here, which is where you would use this J-buckle mount instead. When you're using this J-buckle mount, you can attach your camera to the top here, and because it's higher up from the actual mounting point, you've got much more range of motion, and you can turn your camera back up and down in a much more wider range. So I tend to use this J-buckle mount a lot more than this smaller mount here. I only tend to use this smaller mount if the camera is going to be pointing straight and doesn't need to be tilted back and forward. Now when using a quick release mount within the actual base plate, you may find that you may get a little vibration between the quick release mount and the base plate. Now GoPro provides this doohickey, which you'll receive in the box with your GoPro, and you literally push this into the gap here just to plug in that extra space. And what that does is it reduces or eliminates all of the vibration between the actual quick release mount and the base plate. You can then use your thumb screw and just feed it through this part here, and if I can get that on there, that keeps everything nice and secure, and you can mount your camera or any other mount on top of this like normal, and that keeps everything nice and tight and reduces all vibrations. So don't forget to use your doohickey whenever you can. Talking of base plates, when removing your camera from its packaging, don't throw away the plastic base plate it comes with. It makes an excellent tripod, or you can screw it or stick it up onto surfaces that a suction cup wouldn't hold on to, for example. Or you could actually drill holes into this and create your own DIY chest mount. There's many possibilities, so whatever you do, do not throw away the plastic base plate that comes with the packaging. It really does come in handy. Now moving on, this is one of my favourite mounts. This is the Headstrap mount. Just a few things to mention about this one. When mounting your GoPro to this actual mount, it's a good idea to use one of these straight mounts that we talked about earlier on. So this is not the mount that turns or rotates your camera by 90 degrees. This is a straight mount that you receive with backpacks. It's a good idea if you've got one of these to use this with this mount. So just attach it to the front here, and it gives your camera much more range of motion. It can pivot back and forward much more. So it's a good idea to use one of these. Now I've also found it much more comfortable to use the Headstrap mount without this top strap, so the strap that goes across the top of your head. I found that quite uncomfortable, and you can easily remove this top strap just by sliding it out from the slight cut in the plastic there on both front and back. So we do the same with the back. We simply push it across to one side and slide it out like so, and that gets rid of the top strap, and we've just got the side straps left on this actual mount. And as long as it's nice and tight around your head, it's very secure. It doesn't actually move around, or you shouldn't be afraid of it coming off of your head. It is still very secure, but it's just much more comfortable to wear. Now when attaching this suction cup onto a surface, be it a vehicle body for example, make sure there's no dust or grit or dirt or anything like that on either the suction cup or the surface you're attaching it to. Otherwise you're not going to get a nice firm suction from the actual cup, and the actual suction cup could end up falling off. As long as both surfaces are nice and clean, you're going to get a really strong suction. It's very difficult for this to actually fall off. Now as I said earlier, when mounting your camera, you really do want to get it as close to your mounting point as possible. For example, this isn't ideal, but in some cases you may need to mount the camera further away from the actual mounting point. So for example, I've got all of these mount attachments on here, and then I've got the suction cup. The actual mounting point is down the bottom here. Now the camera goes at the very top there, and it's going to be subject to some vibration. You're going to get some vibration going through all of these mounts. Now I've used this in a previous setup in my vehicle when I was reviewing another item, and I wanted to get an area of the windscreen and dashboard caught in the actual image. So I've mounted this in my vehicle, and as you can see from the footage here, it is subject to a lot of vibration. Now the way to overcome that, if you really do need to use such a long mount, is to try and put your camera up against something solid. So mount this onto your window or wherever you're mounting it to, and try to keep the camera against something solid. So you can see in this image here, what I've done is I've mounted this in the same position as before, although I've pushed it up slightly so the actual camera is touching the roof of the car, so it's up against something quite solid. And that way you're not going to get all the vibrations coming from the mounts up into the camera, because the camera is being held against something solid, and you get some much more stable video, as you can see here. So there we go, some mounting tips and tricks that I do hope you found useful. If you have any other mounting tips, feel free to share them and leave a comment below or post up a video response. Please feel free to check out all my GoPro related reviews either by clicking above or in the description below. Alternatively, take a look at my channel where you'll find an entire playlist dedicated to the GoPro Hero 2 and Hero 3 range of cameras and accessories, and subscribe for more GoPro tips and tricks coming very soon. See you next time on IFTY's Tech Corner.